What's up, everybody? This is Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the new ELAC UBR62. It's their bookshelf reference speaker that just came out like the last, I think maybe 2 months ago. I'll go ahead and say up front that I received this pair on loan for testing purposes from ELAC directly, but they haven't had any say into my review. Matter of fact, I don't even think they've seen my written review that I wrote last week. And they won't see this early, so no issues there. I'm just letting you guys know up front where the speaker came from. Now, with that said, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what I heard first, and then we're going to get into the data, and I'm going to try to help you correlate what I heard, or at least what I think I heard, with what I'm seeing in the data, and then we'll wrap this up and let you go on about your way. The first thing I'm going to say is my subjective listening was done in my living room. And I do all my listening first before I even touch the measurement system because I want to make sure that I'm unbiased by what I see, personally speaking. And just for me, that I know if I see the measurements beforehand, I'm going to have that knowledge in my head and I'm not going to be able to shake it. I listen anywhere from 80 to at max volume, like 80 dB to max volume. And max volume is just kind of dependent on how loud I can get the speaker, either through its own purposes, like an amplifier built into it, or I just feel like it's going to blow up. So I try to get it to where I feel like it's comfortable as far as maximum goes. And that range in this case from, like I said, about 80 dB, I think until the upper 90s. And that's at about 4 meters away, 3 to 4 meters away. And I also did listen in the near field in mono just to see if I was hearing anything that might have been part of the room. So I try to make sure that I test the speaker thoroughly in a multitude of ways to make sure that what I'm hearing is accurate, at least as far as I'm concerned. So let's see here. The one thing I'll note is this speaker has a really low sensitivity, relatively speaking, and most bookshelf speakers incorporating a single mid-woofer, usually around the 85 dB at 2.83 volt, 1 meter reference point. And in this case, the speaker's on the 83.3 dB, and that's the mean. So that's the average output anechoic. So I had to use a more powerful amplifier. I actually have on loan from Parasound 2 of their integrated amplifiers. One is the INT or the NT. I think it's the New Classic 200, which is about 110 watts at 4 or 8 ohm. And then I also have their Hint 6, which is, I think, like 240 at 4 ohm, and then maybe 160 at 8 ohm. It's something like that. But I say that to say the Parasound with the lesser power, the 110 watt at 4.8 ohm, that really wasn't adequate to drive these speakers due to their lower sensitivity. And I needed the bigger, more powerful amplifier from the Hint 6 to drive the speaker, at least to the levels that I really wanted to get it to kind of stress test it and see what it could do. The impedance, so if you're talking about amplifier load, the impedance is nominally around 5 ohm. If you just kind of look at it, it does dip down to 4 ohm, but that's at like 50 hertz or so. It's on the very, very low end, and more than likely, you're not going to be using the speaker full range. As long as you have an amplifier that can do, I would say that 4 or 5 ohms, you're okay. I noticed some resonance in the lower to mid female vocals. And when I say resonance, I went through the battery of trying to figure out what I was hearing, and I wasn't really able to pin it down for sure. So when I say resonance, I don't know if it's like a true resonance in the sense of something, a standing wave or a port resonance. It could just be the fact that there is a pretty broad, from about 500 hertz to 700 hertz, peaking of about 2 to 3 dB in that region. And I think maybe that's what I was hearing. And it kind of just stood out as, what's that phrase people use, honking. It just had a little bit of extra, I don't know, sound to it that I didn't really care for. And another thing that I didn't really like about the speaker was that it just didn't have a lot of grunt in the lower bass. Now, granted, this is a 6.5-inch mid-woofer in the enclosure, but if you look at the actual drive unit itself, it's pretty beefy. And I would probably guess that it's got a good, and this is just a guess, maybe 6 to 7 millimeters of linear throw, like distortion free per the IEC standard. I'm pretty sure that it's got enough mechanical throw and linear throw to provide me with more bass output. It just seems like overall the sensitivity is lower than what I would have preferred it to be, and the bass output also is not as extended on the low end. So typically you see a trade-off for sensitivity. So higher sensitivity will have more or less throw on the low end and vice versa. But in this case, the speaker kind of has both less throw and lower sensitivity. And those were really the only flaws that I had in the speaker. There was also a dip in the mid-bass region, but that's in the measurements, and I couldn't really hear that in the room, and I'll try to come back to that later. Overall, having said those, cons about the speaker, everything else I really liked about the speaker, and I was really impressed with the fact that the soundstage on the speaker. So the really great thing about this speaker is the soundstage. It just has a great three-dimensional soundstage, which pretty much every concentric or coaxial driver or speaker that I've listened to date has done that very well. Most of them, actually all of them except for this one now, have had a more narrow soundstage. And it's something that I don't personally care for when I'm listening. I prefer a more wide soundstage, so a wider radiation pattern. And this speaker has both. It has really excellent soundstage depth because it has that concentric design, but it also has a wide radiation pattern. And in my opinion, that's where this speaker really, really shines. My opinion, going ahead and saying up front, is there's really no issues as far as tonality goes that would make me not buy the speaker. The sensitivity and the low end are the two things that I want more of. But what you get, not necessarily in return or as a trade-off, but as another thing that you get in lieu of that, is the soundstage width and depth is just remarkable. And I really, really love that. I'm going to go ahead. We're going to go to my website. We're going to look at the data, and I'm going to point out some things that maybe hint toward why I heard what I heard. You notice this picture has the drivers taken out. I'll take this grill off and check this out. I like the grill. It's nice. It's sturdy. It's not going to resonate. So that's good. It's also curved, and it's curved because the front baffle of these speakers is curved. The way that this speaker was designed to minimize diffraction is really quite good. And you may be wondering, man, why is this so much more expensive? Because in my opinion, my total opinion is ELAC has always been a value-driven proposition or a value-driven speaker brand. And most of the stuff they came out with to begin with, although they do certainly have their higher end stuff, most of the speakers that they're known for are their, more budget friendly, like the $500, $600, $300-$400 speakers, and this one is right at about $1,000 for the pair. So you're thinking, man, why? And I'll tell you why. And it's because the build quality and some of the things they did that were a little bit extra. They were going a little bit the extra step to minimize diffraction effects by curving the baffle. They've got, I don't know what the crossover network is, but I will tell you that there are no out-of-band resonances. So there's no port resonance that I was able to measure. There was no mid-range or mid-woofer breakup that showed up out of band, so like creeping into the mid-range area, and there was no mid-range breakup. So the speakers, the drivers themselves are very well damped, for the lack of a better word, and that could be due to the crossover network. That could be due to the driver makeup itself, probably a combination of both. But that's what you're paying for, in my opinion, when you pay more for this set of speakers. Now what I want to show you is the concentric driver itself. So you can see the tweeter is in the middle here. It's a 4-inch mid-range, 1-inch dome tweeter, and it's got a grill over it. And it's also curved. You can see the profile. Hopefully this will focus right, and if it doesn't, I apologize. But the speaker does have a profile where it is made to actually fit with the curvature of the enclosure as well. And I think that's kind of neat. It's going the extra step. But the one thing I want you to note is the cone of the mid-range is relatively flat. So a lot of the concentric drivers that I test will be a more narrow. I'm just going to do maybe like when I say narrow, I mean like this. And then when you look at this one, it's more shallow. So the profile of the cone is more shallow. And that, in my opinion, is what is allowing, I guess, the soundstage to be wider. So instead of focusing more energy toward the front, it's letting more energy go out toward the side. But I will say that the tweeter starts to narrow up and beam pretty early, maybe around 8K. We'll get to that in the data. And that is more typical of what you see in a tweeter on a flat baffle as opposed to a tweeter in a waveguide. So I find that interesting. And normally I would say that that's a fault, but I also wonder maybe if that was design intent. And this isn't me, kissing up or anything. It's just trying to understand the design. And you may say, well, why don't you ask Andrew? Well, if I do that and then I tell you that Andrew Jones of ELAC told me what the design was and blah, 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 then people might say, well, you're just, catering to them and now you're making stuff up or he's making stuff up. I don't want to get into that. I want to stay out of the loop. And then if Andrew has any input or advice to it, I will certainly add it to the description below. But for now, I'm just kind of giving you my 2 cents on what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking here. And I hope you can respect that. For my data, for my measurements, I always use Klippel's near field scanner. All of my measurements are done in accordance with the CEA CTA 2034 standard. And if you want to read about that, you can download it for free here. And the reference plane for this measurement is at the tweeter. I also have a series of videos that discuss what the measurement means and how to read them, because I'm not going to do that for every step of the way along in this video. Make sure you check that playlist and I'll put it up here. The things I want to note about this speaker are, first of all, let's look at the on-axis response in black. Notice this dip right here around 150 hertz. That's about 2, maybe 3 dB, maybe even, probably around 3 dB. I didn't hear that in my room, and that is more to do with the Schroeder frequency, which means that below a certain frequency, and usually in most rooms, it's about 400 hertz or so, give or take. The room is responsible for the sound. It really has a lot of modal issues, and the speaker is less characteristic of what you're going to hear, and the room is more characteristic of what you're going to hear. Not to say that nothing below 500 or 400 hertz matters, but that's just kind of giving you a heads up as to why I may not have heard this dip. Now, it could also be that in my room, there is a dip from the ceiling and the floor bounce around, I can't remember now, but it's like 300 hertz to 500 hertz or 200 hertz to 500 hertz, something like that. So this may have just kind of fit right in that pocket and made it to where I didn't really notice it. Going above that, I see that between 500 hertz and 700 hertz, you got a couple little resonances that are standing out. And I say resonances because the data kind of implies that, because you're seeing the things go on or happen off axis as well. I don't know what that is. That could just be a diffraction effect from the mid-woofer. I really don't know what it is. I'm not going to pretend to know what it is. But I will say that when I was listening, I heard some things that kind of sounded a little bit weird in the female vocal, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm wondering maybe if this was it. It could also be at the 250 hertz area, but I felt like it was a little bit higher. And based on what you normally hear in the 500 hertz to 1 kilohertz region, I thought that it was probably in there. So that's more anecdotal than anything. Going above that, let's look even more. You can see some strong on-axis dips, and also you can see some dips in the listening window curve as well. And that really is just something that you typically see in a concentric design. And that is one of the trade-offs. You have an effect from the symmetry of the speaker. So the distance from the mid-range, distance from the tweeter to the baffle edge, also the termination between the tweeter. Hold on. The termination between the tweeter and the mid-range cone. So if I push in on the mid-range cone, you can see kind of a gap where the tweeter is. And that's just part of it. I mean, when you have a concentric design, you've got to put the tweeter somewhere. And in this case, you're seeing the effect of that. And I will note that pretty much everybody that I've talked to that designs concentric speakers will always tell you that listening on axis is not the nominal listening position. Which brings up another thing. Hey, why don't I test concentric designs at about 10 degrees off axis? That's a good point, and it's certainly understandable. However, I think that if you do that, then it's going to make the off axis look really weird, because you're going to have a couple angles that don't really make sense. So I prefer to stick with the on-axis measurement for a concentric design, even though most people are likely bound to listen to them off-axis, because off-axis is where the more neutral response profile is. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. And then we're kind of looking through, like I said, you see a couple mid-range. You see a little bit of a resonance here. The sound power is falling off. Early reflections has a little bit of an issue here. Let's see here. And the directivity indices, there's some things going on around the 1 kilohertz mark. And then, you know, the response kind of flattens out through the mid-range. And then you've got a little bit of a dip, so an omnidirectional radiation pattern in the tweeter area, somewhere around, what is that, 6 kilohertz or so. What does all this mean? Well, that's interesting. So let's just keep going. Estimated in-room response. Now, this is an estimation based on the data from the anechoic measurements of what you're going to hear in your room. And I have shown in another video, I'll put it up here, that the estimation is almost always dead on to what you actually hear in the room as far as taking a measurement in your seated listening position. So you can look at this and get a very, very good idea of what you're going to hear in room. And you'll notice that other than this dip in the mid bass, their response is pretty neutral. I mean, there's this resonance again here, but for the most part, it's pretty linear, especially being for being a coaxial design. When you have coaxial concentric designs, you almost always see dips and peaks in the response. And I find this interesting because I did not hear this speaker as bright. I did not hear it as tweeter heavy or anything like that, but it had a wide soundstage. And how do I know that it had a wide soundstage other than just me listening to it? So let's go to my glow plots that I create. Here's the glow plot that I create that kind of gives you an idea of the radiation characteristics of the speaker. And then the red, the dark red, that's kind of the area that you want to look at just to get an idea of how wide does this speaker radiate out into the room. And looking at this, you can see that it's pretty consistently about 60 degrees wide until you get up to 8 kilohertz where the dome tweeter is starting to beam. I find that interesting because I've not had a concentric speaker that has such a wide radiation pattern. And usually when you have a wide radiation pattern, what happens is you get more energy bouncing off the sidewalls than maybe you would like. And this is totally preference right here. In my case, it's more than I like, and it tends to make the high frequency content a little bit more flat in room, which sounds a little bit more bright than I would care for. But here's the interesting thing. We go back and we look at the on-axis response. You can see that the on-axis response has a little bit of a slope to it, a little bit of a decline. And normally that would not be ideal. But in this case, what I think is that they knew they wanted to, and this is a total guess, they wanted to target a wider radiation pattern. And in order to do so, they needed a more shallow profile on the mid-range cone. But in doing so, they also knew that they were going to have more energy from the sidewalls come back to the listener, and that might sound a little bit more bright than they might want. So to make the trade-off, they took the on-axis response and tilted it down a little bit. And I think that also goes hand in hand with the recommendation that you shouldn't also listen to this speaker on axis. Now, again, that's a total guess, and I really could be off. If Andrew Jones happens to watch this video and he has a comment about it, I will certainly make sure to update my description and let you guys know what he says, or maybe even quote him and pin it or something like that. So for now, that's just my interpretation of the data. Now we're going to keep going and we're going to look at the vertical plot. And you can see that this also has a very wide radiation vertical pattern. And yeah, so it's really, as far as, you know, where you sit, you can sit up or down, on axis, off axis. I think plus or minus 10 degrees to the side, above and below the speaker is probably maybe the sweet spot, both vertically and horizontally. But I would play around with, you know, tilting the speaker one way or the other and maybe sitting above or below it to see what sounds best to you. It may really not make a lot of difference either way, but I would play around with that and see what you think. Now, the one area that I want to make mention of, I'm not even going to talk about distortion because personally distortion isn't that big of a factor, but response linearity as you increase volume to me is, because that is talking about something that you can certainly hear. You can definitely hear the change if bass output is lower than the high frequency output as you turn up the volume. And that's what I've measured here. That's what I'm providing. So what this is telling us, that reference to 76 dB at 1 meter, when you increase the volume to 86 dB, you really don't lose a lot, or you don't gain a lot either way of output. And you see that by this red line right here. At most, it's about 0.4 dB. When you increase it another 20 dB to 96 dB at 1 meter, which is pretty darn loud, especially when you have a pair in a room, you do start to see more significant compression effects where you have about, 3/4 of a dB at 250 hertz. And then you've got even more of that on low end. But it's not so much just the magnitude, but it's also the linearity of that. So it's kind of bumping around between crossover points is what I'm thinking. So this is right around the mid-range to mid-woofer crossover. And it looks to me like the mid-range is probably running out of steam down here at the higher outputs. And then certainly when you get to 102 dB, yeah, you're really pushing the speaker beyond what it needs to be pushed to. Going back to my previous recommendation about not being able to listen to this loud, Yeah, this is really where I think the data is showing that and kind of backing that notion up. And that's it for this review. I hope you appreciate it. I hope you learned something. I know that I was kind of making some assumptions about the design, and I could be totally incorrect. I know that. But I think it's interesting to talk about this kind of stuff. Get those ideas out there, get them flowing. As long as we're honest with each other that we don't know and that these are just assumptions, I think it's kind of cool that you can kind of get your brain working like, okay, how is this speaker potentially designed based on what I'm seeing, as opposed to just looking at the data and saying, well, it's not flat, it can't sound good, because there's always trade-offs in designs, and some designs do things better than others do. And again, in this particular case, the on-axis response is definitely not flat, but the in-room response seems to be what the target was, and I really like the tonality of the speaker. The sound stage, the sound width, depth were fantastic in my personal opinion. The output and the bass level, that's where the speaker's lacking, and that's what I would like to see an improvement on in future designs. So with that said, I appreciate you all watching, and I will talk to you later. Peace.